What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our Phases of Kratom Addiction Recovery series. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at what Kratom is from a pharmacological perspective and what this means in relationship to addiction. We're going to also be doing a basic overview of addiction where we begin to look at the neurochemical and behavioral aspects as well. So let's get into it. And if you see me looking at my notes behind my camera here, I just want to make sure that I get all this information right. So what is kratom? Kratom is the leaf from a tree of the Rubiaceae family, which is a tropical evergreen tree that is native to Southeast Asia. And this is where it has been used in herbal medicine since at least the 19th century. And this plant was brought to the US eventually, and here in the US, we use it for different things like pain management. A lot of people use it for mental health things like anxiety and depression, and it's gained in popularity in the past 10 to 15 years. So let's look at the pharmacology of kratom. So kratom has a number of active alkaloids that provide their pharmacological effects. And the main ones are going to be mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. And these ones are the most known. There are many active alkaloids in kratom, and because kratom is an unregulated, untested, considered herbal supplement, there's a lot that we still don't know about kratom, but these are the two main ones that we know a little bit about. And so what's up with these alkaloids? How do they work in our brains? And then how do they make us feel? So these alkaloids bind to the mu-opioid receptors in the brain. And this is what is responsible for producing its opiate-like effects. And these receptors are also what bind to substances like heroin and morphine and are responsible for producing the high associated with these drugs. So that's definitely a mouthful, these active alkaloids and the mu-opioid receptors and all of that. But basically what's going on is that the active components in kratom are what binds to certain parts of our brains and give us the high that kratom gives us. So that's just a basic overview of what kratom is and what its technical aspects are in how it works in the brain. So getting into a basic overview of addiction. So the mid-century definition of addiction is the state or condition of being dedicated or devoted to something. And I put this in because I thought it was interesting to look at it that way. The modern definition of addiction is different, but I thought it was kind of cool to look at it from that aspect, that being dedicated or devoted to something. And the American Society of Addiction Medicine defines addiction as a treatable chronic mental disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experience. I heard recently somebody define addiction as the progressive narrowing of what it is that gives someone pleasure. And so I thought that was very interesting too, because oftentimes in our addictions, we have this progressive narrowing of our focus into that there's just this one thing or this one substance that gives us pleasure. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing to include as well. So what is the neurochemistry of addiction? This is something that I'm super into and I'm super passionate about. And as I was learning about it in my own Kratom addiction recovery process, I found a lot of value in this because as I was able to see things from this like internal perspective, meaning like, how is my brain working? You know, what's going on in my brain and my body as I'm going through the recovery process, whether it be acute withdrawals, whether it be long-term recovery. And when I was able to learn about these aspects of addiction and what's going on literally in the chemicals of our brains, and also what's going on in our bodies, it gave me a lot of insight and reassurance that what I was going through was completely normal, and it really helped me in my recovery process. So let's break it down. What is going on in our brains when we are addicted to something and then when we are getting off of something? So there's different perspectives as far as looking at neurochemistry with addiction, but we're going to focus on dopamine today. And so what is dopamine? Dopamine is the neurochemical that is responsible for feelings of happiness, contentment, motivation, and satisfaction. There are other neurochemicals that are involved in the process of addiction in our brains, but dopamine gives us a really cool insight into the different aspects of our addiction and why we're feeling the way that we do and why we're behaving the way that we're behaving. So in our brains, we are constantly trying to have balance, and what the technical scientific term for this is homeostasis. What this means, what homeostasis means, is the sense of balance that we achieve when there isn't too much or too little of this dopamine neurochemical in our brains. And so our bodies are constantly trying to achieve this homeostasis. And so when large amounts of dopamine are produced by our brains through using a substance, through behaviors like going on social media and, you know, getting likes or follows, addictions like pornography can produce a dopamine response, different eating and like food addictions can also produce this large amount of dopamine response in our brains. But what happens is that when we have a large amount of dopamine, I didn't mention kratom, that's also, you know, something that produces a large amount of dopamine. And so when our brains create all of this dopamine, what's going to happen naturally is that when the high wears off from whatever the substance or the behavior is that our bodies and our brains are going to do whatever they can do to reach homeostasis again, to reach that balance again. And so I've learned, and this is kind of cool, that in our brains, the pain and pleasure responses that we get from things, that's located in the same part of the brain. So when we have a lot of pleasure from something, the way that our bodies are going to respond when that high wears off from whatever the behavior or the substance is that there's going to be more pain that follows the high from that large amount of dopamine as a way to reach homeostasis. So what that means and what that looks like in our addiction is that when we use kratom, we have a large amount of dopamine that's created in our brains. And after the high wears off, what the hangover is and the coming down aspect of the kratom high and the hangover and that kind of thing is what our bodies and our brains are naturally doing to balance out that large amount of dopamine that we get from the kratom or any other substance or behavior. Excuse me. So this is a natural thing that's going to happen. And when I associated and made the connection in my brain that like, okay, wow, you know, me taking kratom or any sort of substance and seeking out this pleasure that I get from it is going to always be followed by this come down and hangover, or it doesn't even need to be as big as like a hangover. You may just feel down, you may feel bummed out, you may not feel happy anymore. And in comparison to that large release of dopamine, there's always going to be some sort of come down, even if you don't feel physically hungover. So when I made this association that like, okay, anytime I use Kratom, anytime I'm seeking any sort of high from something, that there is going to be this inevitable come down and this inevitable pain and sometimes sadness and depression that's going to follow it. I started to, in my mind, and this was something that was really helpful for me in my recovery process, I associated the pleasure of Kratom and the pleasure of anything for that matter with pain and with the inevitable come down and hangover that was going to happen after I experienced that high. And so I started to really break it down and rationalize it in my brain that like, okay, is this worth it? Is this half an hour to, couple hours, depending on how long Kratom lasted, is it going to be worth it? And all of the times that I came down off of Kratom, how I felt afterwards was so bad, especially at the end, because I was on it for almost 3 years. I was on it for a full 3 years, but the last year of the 3 years, I was on a taper. So I was on it for a total of 3 years. But like at the end, and like when I was in the worst of my addiction in my second year, I felt so horrible, you guys. And like the little bits of, it wasn't even pleasure at that point. Like I had, and this is something important to mention too, like when you're using Kratom for so long, you're damaging this part of your brain where this dopamine producing part of your brain. And it's not permanent damage. I just want to let you know that it does heal. But there is damage that's done to this part of our brains where like, if we keep taking Kratom long term, we're not going to get the same effects that we will in the beginning, because our brains are just outpouring all of this unnecessary dopamine. And there comes a point where it's just, the thrill is gone, basically, and we're not going to feel good anymore. So for me, I got like little moments of like somewhat relief when I would dose, but then I knew that like in an hour, sometimes less, sometimes I'd start going into withdrawals within a half an hour or 45 minutes. I knew that was to come. So like the pain really started to outweigh the pleasure. And like what was going on in my brain and my body at that point was that they were doing everything that my brain was doing everything that it could to try to reach a balance. And taking Kratom over and over and over again for years really pushed my body into this state of like, basically pain and ultimately suffering, because it was trying so desperately to reach the homeostasis that it needed. So that's what it looks like when we're actively in the addiction. When we start to go into the recovery process is when the rewiring and the healing of this part of our brain and the whole dopamine part and like how it's released, how it's formed and created in our brains, all of that needs to heal. And so when we quit Kratom and we are taking away what has been our source of dopamine, and like we were saying earlier, that somebody defined addiction as the progressive narrowing from things that give us pleasure. And so when we come to the end of our Kratom addiction, Kratom is basically the only thing that we are looking to for pleasure. A lot of times it doesn't get, like I was just saying, it doesn't give us that pleasure anymore. But we are still looking to it because of how we felt in the beginning to be our basically only source of pleasure. And for me at the end, Kratom was first priority over everything, over food, over the people that I loved, over everything in my life. And so it was that progressive narrowing. And what happens when we quit on a neurochemistry level in this, discussion about dopamine and what's going on is that when we remove this source of what has given us dopamine for however long you've been taking Kratom, there is this healing and rewiring process that has to happen. And like we were saying, how the pain and the sickness and the sadness and the depression and the anxiety, panic attacks, anhedonia, all of that is the counterpart to all of that dopamine that our brains had been getting in our addiction. And that is that our bodies and our brains desperately trying to reach homeostasis. That's what's going on when we quit Kratom. And it happens when we cut back too, if you're on a taper, is that it's happening slowly as opposed to if you cold turkey and you quit it and then it happens all at once. But that's what's going on, is that our brains and our bodies are fighting for that balance. And depending on how long you've taken Kratom, for me, I took it for 3 years total. I've known people who have been on it for 10 years. And that's going to factor into how intense that pain and that all those, symptoms that we just said, as our bodies are desperately trying to reach balance again, that's going to determine how long that lasts for. So when we remove this source of dopamine, which is the Kratom, our brains and our bodies are freaking out, man. That's a very basic way of explaining it. We can go into the neurochemistry and we can get into things like, dopamine and pain and pleasure response and all of that kind of thing. But on a very basic level, when we take away what our brains have been used to for feelings of happiness, contentment, peace, pleasure, all of that, our brains are going to freak out, man. So this is completely natural. And this is what the acute withdrawals are at first when we quit Kratom. Because when we remove that source of dopamine, and depending on how long we've been on it, we're going to need our brains, this part of our brain where we were producing dopamine from the Kratom, is going to need the chance to heal. And there is going to be a payback, unfortunately, when we quit Kratom, because our bodies are going to need to go through that process, that healing process, that pain, that depression, that anhedonia, all those different symptoms. It's going to need to go through that to heal. So how does it look like when we start getting into long-term recovery? I've heard it said before from somebody who was a heroin addict that the post-acute withdrawal side of Kratom, meaning what the long-term recovery symptoms are for Kratom, were way worse than actual heroin. That's one person's perspective. We can't say that it's going to be everybody's perspective, but it gave me valuable insight into that. Kratom is no joke when it comes down to recovery. And so when we get into the long-term aspects of recovery, what's that going to look like on a neurochemical level? So it's going to take time for our brains and our bodies to heal from this addiction. And how long it's going to take will be based on different factors. But what's going on is that the part of our brain that is responsible for creating dopamine, it needs to heal. And so as we go through our post-acute long-term recovery stuff, we're going to reach all sorts of different levels of this healing process. And I'm going to be straight up with you. A lot of times it's not going to be easy. But what is going on is that things are rewiring in our brain. Like I was saying earlier, like the part of our brain that's responsible for creating dopamine, it's damaged by Kratom, because when we take it multiple times a day for, months, years on end, we are like literally burning out this part of our brain, because we are making our brains produce all of this dopamine. And so it needs time to heal. And what this looks like and how we're actually feeling is that for a lot of us, we hit really deep levels of like depression and anhedonia, which means the inability to feel pleasure from anything. I personally went through this in my process, and it was one of the hardest parts of it. So when we are in this long-term recovery where our brains are just like, where's the dopamine that you were giving me? And I'm still healing, and you're not going to feel joy or pleasure from anything else yet, but like, where's what you used to give me? And, when we hit that point where we're done with Kratom and we're not taking it anymore, we got to go through this healing process. And I say this all the time when I talk about my recovery, that it took me a year and a half to get through my post-acute withdrawal stuff. And I don't say that to scare anybody. I say that because that's actually what it took, and I don't like sugarcoating anything. But what was going on was that, like I'm saying, my brain was healing from this addiction. And I did different things to help this process. And we're going to get into this in a lot of detail as we come up to that phase in the recovery process in this series, where I talk about long-term recovery and post-acute withdrawal syndrome and what helped. I do have 2 videos on my channel here in the meanwhile. One is called Anhedonia and Kratom Addiction Recovery. And then another one is called My Experience with Long-Term Kratom Recovery, where I go into post-acute withdrawal stuff and I talk about just a basic overview of what I did to help me. So you're welcome to check those out in the meanwhile. And I know that when we get into this video in this series where we talk about the long-term recovery aspects and we really go into detail about what helped, that I think that's going to be useful for a lot of you guys. But just to wrap this up, what we get into on a neurochemical level when we actually come out of the long-term recovery aspect of Kratom addiction is that our brains heal and rewire. And what goes on is that the parts of our brains that are responsible for producing dopamine heal. And then we're able to feel joy and pleasure and contentment from simple things again, which has been one of the greatest blessings and gifts in recovery for me. And it started slowly for me at first, where at about the 1.5 year mark, I noticed that it was starting to lift. And then over the next 1.5 years that followed, which is the past 1.5 years that I went through, things progressively got better and better. And I'm now at the point where I wake up every day and I have simple joy and contentment and pleasure from like the littlest things, which is one of the biggest, like I said, most awesome things about recovery for me. So that's the conclusion about, the neurochemical aspect of this whole dopamine topic when we look at Kratom addiction and recovery. And I wanted to conclude on a positive note that as, we get into how damaging Kratom addiction is, or any other addiction for that matter, you can, look at any other substance, and even behaviors too can get into the territories of this, whole dopamine thing that we're talking about. But there is a lot of damage that's caused by Kratom addiction and other addictions. And so I wanted to conclude on that positive note that everything can be healed. We have the opportunity in our recovery to heal and be restored in our minds and bodies, and to become these amazing people that through what we had been through have learned so much. And it deepens our not only understanding of ourselves, and that's one of the reasons why I love going into the actual neurochemistry and breaking down addiction on a deep level and on a behavioral level, because we're learning about ourselves. And this helps us to grow as people. We learn some of the greatest lessons from our addictions and recoveries. And it deepens not only our understanding and then our eventual wisdom that comes from it, but it deepens our capacity for compassion and empathy, not only for ourselves, but for others. So that when we go through this experience, we are made into better people because of it. And when we reemerge on the other side of it, we go on in our lives to, reach different people and to have compassion and empathy for people that we otherwise wouldn't have. So I want to encourage you that, this is gnarly, man. Addiction is so gnarly. Getting off of it, going through experiencing, having our brains affected by this substance and this addiction and then healing from it. It's hard, man. This is hard work. It makes us take a hard look at ourselves. It makes us go through a lot of pain and discomfort and suffering. But I want to remind you that it's not for nothing. So as we continue this series, we're going to be breaking down all the aspects of this process. And I'm so stoked that you're here. And this is a great community that's growing. And I encourage you, if you'd like support or encouragement, to join us in the comments section. And, if you want to share some of your story or where you're at, please feel free to do so. Or if you have any questions, or if you just like some company, because for a lot of us, we're alone when we're in our addiction and in our recovery. So if you just would like, some company from other people who are going through it or who have been through it before, feel free to join our community in the comments section. And I will see you in our next video as we continue in the phases of Kratom Addiction Recovery. All right, see you then. Bye.